Hello, everybody. How are you? Welcome to our webinar this morning, The Cloud Revolution and the Data Protection Evolution. With me today, I've got Jason Buffington, who is from Enterprise Strategy Group, ESG. Many of you are probably familiar with Jason. You know him as an expert in data protection. My name is Jeff Aramospi. I have been the CEO of Spanning Cloud Apps. We were acquired by EMC back in October, and I am now the VP and GM of Spanning by EMC. You can see our contact information here on this slide that talks about the panel. We're glad to have you with us today, and we look forward to a good session. Jason, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Great, great. Before we get going, I've got a few quick things. Number one, your audio will be available through your computer speakers using voice over IP. We are going to take questions throughout this session, so if you would send in your questions using the chat feature, that would be terrific. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all of you, the attendees, and frankly, all registrants via email after the event. So with that, let's go ahead and jump on into the agenda for today. There's our panel again, and here's our agenda. First off, Jason's going to cover a number of things, talking about some of the macro trends around IT spending priorities and how those relate specifically to backup and backup of SaaS applications, how the cloud is changing the role of the backup admin, and talk a good bit about modernizing data protection as you modernize your IT production. Then I'm going to talk a bit about SaaS data loss stories that you can learn from and the need for SaaS data protection and some of the best practices around SaaS data protection. We'll give you some real specific examples of SaaS data loss that has occurred, how it occurs, and how it can have some impacts on you, and why you really need to protect yourselves from that. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jason and let him get us started. Jason, off to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from today. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Jason Buffington. I'm an analyst with the Enterprise Strategy Group. I have been in data protection for about 25 years, and I've been covering everything that is backup and snapshots and replication and BCDR on behalf of ESG for the last 4 years or so. Every year, let me take a step back. If you really want to know what some of these priorities are, if you really want to understand, what's really happening in somebody's lives, I once got a great piece of advice from my pastor who said, if you really want to know what some of these priorities are, look in their checkbook. Certainly, every analyst firm has their own way of trying to predict the future. We just ask people, what do you plan on spending money on next year? And so we ask that series of questions every November, December timeframe, and so these are what your peers answered for the IT priority plan spend, what you actually are planning to spend money on in 2015. And there's a couple of things I think are interesting. Certainly on the very top of the screen, information security overshadows all the others. I think we can, in large part, thank Sony for that. But then also notice an improving backup and recovery, number 2. Business continuity disaster recovery, the more strategic side of data protection, comes in at number 8. And then we have the ones in between. And I think that's really interesting, and let me tell you why. Because when you look at what's in the middle, when you look at the other modernization trends that we might see, there's actually a trend here. So managing storage growth, increasing server virtualization, increasing use of cloud, improving collab capabilities. In each of those scenarios, the idea is that as businesses are transforming, they are driving IT modernization. Now, the fun part is that no matter whether you go to a significantly higher amount of unstructured storage, whether you embrace virtualization to a higher degree, whether you go to cloud, however you modernize production, what you will very quickly find is that in many cases, your legacy approaches for data protection will not follow. A highly virtualized environment can't be protected by an antiquated approach using VM-based solutions. Cloud-based services cannot be protected typically by on-premise backup solutions. So as you modernize production, you have to modernize protection to go along with that. And in fact, that's probably not true anywhere more than it is with increasing use of cloud infrastructure. Cloud really is changing not only production dynamics, but protection dynamics as well. Now, these are the technical initiatives associated with modernization in 2015, but we also want to look at where the money's going. What are the business drivers that are affecting overall IT spend? ESG asked about that too. And we look at the business initiatives that are driving IT spending, just kind of look at the top 5 for a few minutes, because I think, it tells an interesting story. Again, security and risk comes at the very top of that stack, which you could argue really is kind of the combination of information security and data protection. Those first two on the last slide manifested together this time in reducing overall risk. Certainly, cost reduction always comes in very near the top of this list. And again, just like we saw on the last slide, regulatory compliance, part of that including the preservation and protection of data, also coming in within the top 5. But let's look at the cost reduction for a second. So in this case, we see other than security, cost reduction is the number 2 business initiative that's driving IT. If you double click into that, this is what we see. How are folks going to be containing costs was the question. And interestingly enough, prior to 2013, when ESG asked this question year over year, we would typically get things like, well, I'm going to slow down. Right? I'm going to postpone projects. I'm going to freeze hiring. I'm going to cancel this. Slow down that, etc. No one ever got ahead by slowing down. And so what we've seen over these last 2 or 3 years is that the method by which cost containment happens in most organizations is not by slowing down. It's by doing things smarter. And that's really what the top 3 cost containment measures that you and your peers have said for the last 2 years now. Top 3, and in the same consistent band here. Number 1, renegotiate contracts. Yeah, you want to keep doing what you're already doing, but you'd like to pay less. That makes sense. I'm going to skip down. Number 3, purchase new technologies with improved ROI. So again, this is not about slowing down or halting. This is about doing things smarter. In this case, getting more and actually paying less. And then the last one, in that middle slot in the number 2 category, increased use of cloud as an alternative to in-house applications and or infrastructure. And again, all 3 of these band together as just doing IT smarter. Well, we're going to see cloud. We saw cloud in the very first slide as far as increasing usage. We see cloud here as a method of reducing cost. We're going to see that again if we actually look at where are the dollars actually going. We asked that as far as what the percentage of the 2015 IT budget are allocated to each category. And not to anyone's surprise, certainly staff comes in at the highest single amount, 28% on the bottom of your screen. We see hardware and software coming in at the 36% of overall infrastructure, not including the 12% for info. But take a look in the second category down, purple, 8%. 8% of annual IT budget on average now going to cloud-based services overall. And by the way, interestingly enough, we find that that number will vary based on the age of the company. If you're a well-established company, let's say 50 years or old or longer, then only 6% compared to 8%. Still, in a company that large, in a company that venerable, to have 6% of your budget going to cloud is actually rather impressive. But for companies that are 10 years or less, 10%. In fact, so it looks like the younger the company, the more you might just go straight to the cloud and say, why would I ever put servers in my environment when the cloud can satisfy those needs for me?
Yeah. So Jason, quick question for you. So a couple of questions here, actually. And the first one may be a little bit difficult to answer, but do you have any idea sort of what the degree of efficiencies people get out of going to cloud computing? So, while we see 8% there as the amount of the budget that is spent on cloud computing services, does that 8% give them the same value as, sort of the 19% and the 17% spent on hardware and software respectively? Do you have an idea of sort of, what sort of efficiencies people are getting?
So efficiency is a weird number to calculate, right? Because there's a lot of different biases for that one. So in some cases, I think it's going to depend on what kind of service they're gaining from it. So for example, if you were talking about email, that's one of the ones I kind of like to pick on quite a bit. If you're talking about email, the idea of now having a wholly durable well-connected email system as opposed to maintaining an exchange farm, the efficiency is probably off the charts.
Yep.
When you look at things like file and collab, it may not have quite the same amazing return as email, just because of the fact there's a different kind of user experience there. But again, you should see quite a bit of return for that. If you're looking at things like dev, if you're looking at things like application development, those kinds of platforms, it might make more sense to actually have those things to be on-prem, based on the kind of infrastructure you're trying to facilitate. So that's going to vary based on the workload. But in fact, in a couple slides, I'll actually take the folks through what workloads actually are really going to the cloud. And I think you could safely say that the consensus of who's going to the cloud the fastest can relate to us what people are recognizing as best efficient workloads to move in that direction.
Yeah, interesting. And the other thing that I just wanted to add in here is that your data insight there, that companies operating for 10 years or less spend a larger percentage of their budget on cloud computing services. I think I mentioned to you the other day, I think if you looked at companies that are 5 years or less old, you would probably find that number being vastly higher. We, using Spanning as an example, we're about 5 years old. We don't have a single server in our company. Everything we do, anything that's server-based, all of our applications, everything we do in the cloud, including delivering our own service in the cloud. So, I mean, sure, from our budget perspective, it's probably 50–60%. The only thing we have, otherwise is network, people, and the laptops that we have that we operate on a daily basis. So, kind of interesting how that shift is occurring.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you were starting a company from scratch, you would not, go say, okay, how many servers do I need? I've been in IT now 25 years. If I ever opened up an office anywhere, the very first thing that I did was stand up a file server, yep. And then later, the next thing I might do is, okay, how are we going to do email? And for smaller organizations, yeah, that totally makes sense across the board. So I get that.
It's all done in the cloud now. So interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
All right. And again, I mean, there'll be some workloads that still stay put, and we're going to talk about those in a second. Now, the cloud, I love that term because you almost always have to put it in air quotes, the cloud. There's not a cloud, right? So there's lots of different clouds, lots of different platforms. And so one of the things that ESG wanted to look at was what kinds of clouds, plural, are folks really adopting? And going from the bottom up, platform as a service, that has a different connotation than the two scenarios that we've talked about so far, Jeff. We look at, say, infrastructure as a service. We're going to look at that in just a few minutes as well. But then, of course, the examples I gave were around email, around file and collab services. Those are going to be software as a service. And so what you can see here is for those folks that are leveraging cloud, 68% of them are leveraging some kind of software as a service. And then you'll notice that if you look at the blue, which is the current using, and then the green, not current but planned to, you'll see that 68 jumps up to 82%, 4 out of 5 organizations using some form of software as a service over the next 2 years. Meanwhile, infrastructure as a service, so we have 41%, a little under half, 2 out of 5 today. Add another 16%, now we're at 57%, so we break the halfway mark on that for those folks using infrastructure as a service. So lots of different ways to consume cloud, certainly different platforms and use cases. We can double-click into these as well. If we double-click into infrastructure as a service, for example, here's something interesting. We asked folks, how does or did your organization use cloud infrastructure services? Check this out. The #1 use case for using cloud for infrastructure, data backup and archive. Number 3 is disaster recovery. So 2 of the top 3 trends around using infrastructure service have to do with data protection, both the tactical side in #1 and the strategic side in the #3 slots. Test dev comes in #2 just because compute is so much cheaper. Spin it up, spin it down, and we'll use what you pay for. You have to get to #4 on the list before you actually end up with a production workload. And I think that's really interesting. That's infrastructure as a service. If we look at software as a service, it's even more intriguing because in software as a service, take a look at this curve. Over the last 4 years, 4 years ago, 34% of organizations in 2011 said, yes, we're using software as a service somewhere in our org. 4 years later, that number has doubled from 34 to 68% of organizations now using software as a service somewhere during their org. And Jeff, as I mentioned, when we look at what is the platforms that folks are using for this, what kinds of applications are going to the cloud, this, I think, speaks back to where folks are really starting to see that efficiency come into play, as well as the trajectory on how fast they're going to get there. So in this case, application deployment, let me just kind of unpack this for you. So what we ask folks is, in 5 years, which model do you expect your organization to be delivering for each of the types of business applications? Now, I'm going to use the bottom one because I picked on it earlier, email. Within 5 years, only 43%, less than half, of all mail services will be delivered on-prem, right? Of the 57% of mail services that will be delivered by the cloud in a SaaS-based model, 27%, the green lines, are already being delivered that way. That is, by far Office 365 and Google Mail more than anything else. And then another 30%, even more that are already there, are going to go that way over the next 5 years. And frankly, as that 5 years starts to count down, I'd be surprised if those numbers hold true. I'd be surprised if even 43% stay on-prem. My personal gut, without the data, says that's going to look more like 25 to 30. So it's just too easy not to do. But then certainly
that's my reaction as well there when I look at those numbers. It feels to me like people that are on-prem today are still thinking they want to stay on-prem, but I have a feeling that the momentum is going to pick up and that number is going to be much smaller. That was my reaction as well.
Oh yeah, and in fact, so we see that as kind of the trepidatious few when you look at any time we've had a transformational IT platform shift. If you looked back, say, 5 years on server virtualization, right? You probably wouldn't see the adoption numbers projected 5 years out that we actually have today. It would be more cautious than that, because back then, 5 years, folks are saying, well, and I know it's going to happen, but I'm not sure how fast it's going to get there. And then a year goes by and 2 years go by, and it's like, wow, this stuff really has taken off. And wow, I really do get new value out of this. And yeah, I don't want to wait 5 years. Sign me up. And so I would expect that SaaS will have a lot of that same kind of unexpected acceleration as time continues on. We see the same things for file and collab. So, for example, I mentioned Office 365 earlier, so Office productivity, file and collab stuff, both of them have that 46 to 48, so less than half still on-prem. Again, I think those will likely shrink as it continues to gain momentum. And just like in email, roughly 40% of those going to cloud already are. Another 60% will move forward from that. And even other platforms like Salesforce, for example. Who today would go and stand up their own CRM application? Instead, it's just too easy not to do. So that's the momentum. And just like I said on that first slide, though, as you modernize production, as you do a true radical shift in how you're delivering production services, you will have to modernize the protection that goes along with that. There's actually two kinds of drivers that are really forcing this. One of them we've already talked about, change in platform where your legacy backup approach can't follow. Right? The other one is the human factor. So if we think about the human factor, what we're also seeing, now this data actually comes out of a report that all the previous data came out of ESG's IT Spending Intentions report, and you should feel free to go and look at the abstract and some of the data that comes out of that. If you're a subscriber to ESG, you can download that as well. This next set of data actually comes out of another ESG report that I was part of called the Data Protection Personas and Methods Research. And basically what we looked at was the who that's responsible for data protection. I attribute this kind of like what I call the audacity of BYOD. The audacity of BYOD is, if you think about it, 10 years ago, Jeff, when you and I would have joined a company, the company IT department would have just handed us a laptop. Here you go, right? Fast forward 5 years, we show up at that new organization. They say, okay, well, IT publishes a list. Here's the 8 models that you can choose from. So you can pick what fits your style of productivity the most. Today, you show up to work at a new company. They say, okay, what are you bringing? Right? Okay, we know how to help you figure out how to connect that in. There's a radical shift as far as how the control happens from IT down to end users. We're seeing that same kind of audacity shift in the workloads as well, because the workload administrators, they're the ones who are responsible for the productivity of the platform. just like you and I are responsible for the productivity of ourselves, and therefore they want to help choose the tool that ensures that productivity. And so when we looked at who's actually responsible for data protection within an organization, what we found was a fragmentation, where the database admin says, I need to be involved in this process. I know the app better than anybody else, so I should be responsible for part of the backup, and I certainly want to be responsible for part of the recovery. We see the same kind of sentiment coming from the storage and file admin. We see the same kind of sentiment coming from the V admin as well. So we're seeing a fragmentation where the workload owners understand they're responsible for the platform. They know the app better than anybody else, and as I said, if any recovery is going to happen, they need to be part of that as well. And so here's how this works as it relates to some of these new modern platforms that we see. As I said, 10 years ago, backup admin was in charge. Everything got backed up the same way, right? 5 years ago, fast forwarding through that, each of those workload admins are saying, you know, I really want to be part of this conversation. Backup admin was still choosing, but now it was more of a collaborative discussion. What we're seeing, according to the data that I showed you on that last chart, is it looks more like this, where the file admins, the database admins, the VM admins are saying, look, I'm responsible for these platforms. I may or may not use the same tool that you use or even the same vendor, but I know I need to be part of that process as well. Now, the backup admin doesn't go away because there's still the requirement for oversight. Just because those workload guys and gals can do those backups doesn't necessarily mean they're holding data for the same length of time. Doesn't mean that they're actually ensuring that backups happen because, by the way, they're kind of busy just making sure those platforms are creating value for the organizations overall. And oh, by the way, besides those independent workloads, certainly the backup admin is responsible for the everything else, the things that don't have dedicated expertise. And one of the interesting dynamics that we're starting to see is that the new dynamic looks more like this, where SaaS is becoming just another, let's call it an island. It's another transformational platform where there is typically a dedicated admin. That admin typically is segmented, just like the V admin, just like the DBA, et cetera. Just like in the other cases, they know their platform and they're responsible for that platform more than, say, IT operations generalists. The backup admin absolutely still has a role to play to ensure that all the workloads, all the corporate data, because it's corporate data, regardless of what platform it lives on, still needs to be protected. And yet there needs to be a partnership there between the person who knows the platform, in each of these cases, and the backup admin who understands the requirements of the business to ensure the data is protected. Amen?
Yep, sounds good. So a quick question, I guess. You know, with respect to the SaaS admins in particular, I mean, my assumption is the file services admins understand the need for backup. The database admins understand that. You know, VM admins certainly by now do. I mean, VM has done a good job of convincing them that they absolutely need it, I think, at this point. But the SaaS admins, do they really understand the need to protect their data?
No, but I would argue that none of these workload admins, if given their own choice, would back up the data to the same standard that the company actually needs the data backed up to, right? Because if you think about it, the three workloads on the left, their primary job is to ensure the availability and the usability of the platforms themselves for the benefit of the organization, right? You know, so the file admins will do things like they'll add clustering and they'll add file-based replication and they'll do storage-based mirroring and all the good stuff that makes sure that happens. None of that would hold the data for more than, say, 30 days, 45 days. Database admins are notorious. They'll dump their data, they'll do log shipping, log mirroring. They got all kinds of ways to make sure that database can go back because they need to ensure the productivity of the database. But again, a DBA probably doesn't need versions of that whole database much more than 60, 90 days old in general. They're focused on availability. They're not necessarily focused on retention of data, which might be required for discovery, for regulatory compliance, for information governance. The admins are much the same way. They're thinking, okay, if I can just make sure the VM will bounce between hosts or between clusters or between sites, I just got to make sure it stays running. And that's actually about the same dynamic that SaaS is at. The difference is that a SaaS admin knows that you've got this this public cloud provider that has a massive infrastructure that's designed for availability, right? Not many people wonder whether Office 365 is going to be up today, like they wonder about an email server, right? Because, I mean, this is Microsoft. If it's not running on a server in Redmond, it's running on a server in Santa Fe or Boston or someplace else. But your mail will work. It's an availability solution. So unlike the three admins on the left, they rely on or presume availability, whereas the other guys have to kind of figure out how to build it themselves. But in all four cases, what the workload owner is really mindful of is ensuring the users have access to the data. It's a productivity, availability, durability thing. It's not recovery. So for example, I go delete a file from the file admin. I go and trim out a record within the database. I delete data within a VM. You know, in all those scenarios, none of those availability solutions would help because it just gets replicated to the other copies. Same thing with SaaS. If I delete my mail on Office 365, if I'm sharing a directory with my contemporaries and they overwrite last month's budget spreadsheet with this month's budget spreadsheet, but I still need last month's spreadsheet. In all of those scenarios, valid rights are valid rights, and none of the availability scenarios address that. But all four of those guys have, or gals, all four of their lenses are short-term lenses, not recovery or retention lenses. So in that case, they all four are kind of blind to the longer view.
Right. Great. Well, before we jump into my section here, we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and you know, at least would like you to kind of read it, chime in on these pretty quickly. The first question is that someone asked, is the cloud services percentage grow? Does that mean that the hardware and software expense in your budgeting chart are going to drop?
Yeah, I mean the staffing won't, right? Because it still requires expertise. The stuff is still self-managed. But yes, you should expect that you know, you won't be paying for as many cows for some of those sockets. You won't be paying for that infrastructure. By the way, not only the hardware, but don't forget the power, the cooling, the actual real estate square footage. So yes, so one of the other intrinsic benefits of going to cloud. And that's one of the reasons why it's sometimes kind of hard to calculate that overall value prop, because it's not like you can say, in fact, I wrote a blog post a while back and I tried to get rid of a file server, and the cloud services would have cost me basically a file server a year from a hardware perspective. But if you think about it, that doesn't include my power, it doesn't include my costs of management. None of that is in there. So yeah, so some of the hard costs will go away. Some of the operational costs will go away. Cloud will come up. And oh, by the way, don't forget your availability actually goes up as well, you know, compared with maintaining things on-prem. So there's a lot of different ways to calculate what that efficiency might look like. Certainly, I would not say every single person cloud is always a silver bullet, always make things better. You know, you're going to have to look at the OpEx and CapEx ratios for yourselves. But for those where it does economically make sense, you just need to understand that once you go that way, from my perspective, data protection will not follow, but data protection still has to occur. That needs to be part of your plan as well.
Terrific, thanks. So the second question that we had was really relating to whether or not, you know, sort of the efficacy of the cloud mail services. So someone says, most people I speak to who use Office 365 or Gmail use it, but they don't really like it. And the second one was, we've been with on the cloud with email for 4 years, but struggle with poor service from one of the majors and are considering bringing it back in-house due to the poor service. So any thoughts on that, and do you see that potentially, that poor service or the fact that people may not like it, possibly slowing down adoption of email, at least as a core application that gets run in the cloud?
So overall public cloud consumption is not my primary area of expertise any more than, you know, on-premise database architecture is. I'm a data protection guy, so I look at the world as far as once you've got it, how do you protect it? But let me offer something that I've gleaned from several anecdotes. Often when I hear people say, I went from an on-premise mail server to a cloud-based mail service, and my service is horrible. Often the reason that happened, and I get this when I go to trade shows, we kind of talk it out, is that folks say, okay, well, I'm used to having LAN speed access to my mail server. It's just down the hall or it's on the floor below me. I got rid of my mail server. I now have 50 or 75 or 200 users, and they're now going across my WAN connection. And oh, by the way, I didn't actually open up my WAN connection. I didn't make the WAN any bigger to the outside world, but all of a sudden now, instead of going across my LAN, I am using the internet to go there. So that is one of the costs that sometimes people don't think about is you're getting rid of some of those hardware costs, but you do need to up your telco because now you got a whole lot more people that are going out for stuff they used to just bounce around in and never think about. So when I typically hear about performance, that's often the primary scenario is they didn't accommodate for WAN traffic more than anything else. And frankly, that's no differently than if I had built a physical set of servers and then I decided to go to a virtualized set of servers and I didn't replumb my networking infrastructure. You know, when you change the flow of water, I live in Texas, and so we are very familiar with changing the flow of water after all the rains in May. When you change the flow and you don't have an accommodation for that, flooding or bottlenecks will occur.
Yep, no question. All right, well, just a quick reminder before we move into this next section that if you have questions, you go ahead and ask them in the questions section or in the chat section, whichever you prefer. We're monitoring them both. Well, thanks, Jason. That was really, really good information and I think good background and data as we move into the second part of the presentation here. So one of the questions that I get asked more than anything else is, do in fact organizations lose data in SaaS applications? And the fact is they do, and it happens all the time. A lot of times your IT organization may not know about it, and the reason they may not know about it is that, especially when we're talking about office productivity applications like Office 365 or Gmail, Google Apps, is that the end user is the one that suffers the brunt of that loss, and they figure out how to deal with it in order to get their job done. They accidentally delete a spreadsheet. They may go recreate that spreadsheet from scratch in order to meet their business need. Clearly, it impacts productivity. What we have seen is we recently did a research report, a study, surveyed a number of companies who were using SaaS applications, and amongst the ones that were willing to admit it, 58% of those companies using SaaS apps reported that they had a significant data loss at some point in the recent past. That data loss sometimes was an inconvenience, and sometimes it caused a critical problem to the business and actually had a pretty significant business impact. We'll talk about some of those things in a minute. The key is what causes that data loss. And by and large, the top 5 reasons for SaaS data loss are human mistakes. Human error happens all the time. Programmatic errors, which frankly are also a form of human error. The problem with programmatic errors is when you have an application that is manipulating your data in a SaaS environment, is that mistakes, when they happen at compute speed, can delete or alter a whole lot of data very, very quickly. And so that's something that we see in particular in environments like Salesforce.com, where you're going to have multiple applications that are integrating and lots of different developers who are creating code that is going to exchange data at the application level, is going to cause some problems around some of that. So, that's one of the key things that happens a lot is the programmatic errors. We also tend to deal with malicious insiders, and of course you've got external threats and viruses and malwares. Of course, the malicious insiders are people inside your company who for some reason want to do damage to the company because of a lack of maybe confidence in the company, or they're just annoyed at something, unhappy with something, mad about something. They may want to do some damage to the company. Obviously, external threats, we all know that we're all putting up all kinds of defenses in order to keep hackers out. And then obviously the virus and malware that sort of come from the same kinds of folks that are trying to hack you as well. All of those are reasons for SaaS data loss. One of the things that we don't have so much is to worry about in a SaaS environment are things like hardware failure and software failure and natural disaster and power outage. These are the things that Jason implied are really taken care of by the SaaS vendor because they're the ones that are focusing on that availability. So what data protection is provided by your SaaS vendor, and what are the pieces that are missing? Where are the holes that exist? What do they provide? The most important thing they provide is absolutely amazing SLA-backed application protection. When it comes to availability, they've got real-time replication of servers, they've got clustered active servers, and effectively an RTO and an RPO of virtually zero with respect to the availability angle. They provide great levels of security, continuous intrusion detection, multi-factor authentication that keeps people from being able to easily take passwords and be able to get into your system. And obviously, they provide a ton of reliability. You know that by and large that the application is going to work in the way that you expect it to work. Everything is programmed correctly. Been tested, and the fact that it's being used by lots of different people all at the same time means that bugs are found very, very quickly and they're fixed very quickly. So reliability of the application tends to be very good. They also provide some limited protection for the user-generated data loss, but they won't provide an SLA around it. So most of these applications provide some kind of trash or recycle bin. But data often ages out of those bins in certain periods of time, 14 days, 30 days, 90 days. Could depend based on the application and on the vendor. And in fact, in some cases, you can configure those things. Those trash and recycle bins can always be emptied by end users. And that's one of the things that's the key here. When you have a malicious insider who decides they want to delete a bunch of emails that are important to the company, they're going to go to the recycle bin, but then that malicious insider is going to go empty that recycle bin. And it's likely to be gone potentially forever. And of course, those trash and recycle bins will only include what was the last version of the file or the email. It won't include any previous versions or edited versions of the file along the way. So if you're using Google Drive and someone deletes a file and then empties the recycle bin, or even if you were to find it in the recycle bin, it would only be the version that was deleted. You wouldn't be able to get a version that was available from, say, 20 days ago, something like that. Many of these SaaS providers will also have some sort of legal hold capability. Typically, we see those only on email. When they do get those legal holds, it's pretty typically limited access. And it's very, very difficult, even though those files or those emails are saved, to restore in a very quick and easy way so that you can continue to operate your business. Those applications are not designed for a restoration. And then some of them do provide some amount of restoring services, but it's very limited availability. There'll be costly services engagements, and they're slow and typically best efforts. And what I mean they do here is that they will sometimes allow you to go back to, because they're running bunches of servers, they're backing those things up to frequently things like data domain from EMC and potentially even to tape beyond that. They might allow you to go back to the tapes for a fee to pull some of those, some of your lost data back in from their own backup processes. Again, it's going to be very expensive, it's going to be very costly, and your results are going to vary considerably. What they don't provide is the ability to completely protect your data. It's interesting because SaaS vendors are kind of in a little bit of a conundrum. Because it's your data and you own it, you have the ability to have it deleted. So if I go to Google and I say, I want these emails deleted, they have an obligation to go delete those emails. Or if I go to Salesforce and I say, I want to delete these account records inside my Salesforce.com instantiation, they need to delete those things. The problem is they don't know whether my deletion request is legitimate or not. They don't know whether I've got the right authority, whether or not I've gotten a hold of somebody else's login credentials and am impersonating that user and doing damage to the company. They don't know if I'm a disgruntled employee, with the malicious insider we talked about, trying to delete those things. So all the way around, it becomes something that's very difficult for them to tell whether or not the request is legitimate or not. They've got to delete it. And so they sort of take and absolutely absolve themselves of the responsibility there. Google is very clear in their Google Apps for Work terms of service. When data is deleted from Google, it's not recovered. Salesforce is one of the ones that offers a paid service. It's exceptionally expensive, time-consuming, and it's what they call best efforts. You're going to get data that's likely 3 or 4 weeks old when it gets recovered, and it's likely to take you weeks for that to be recovered. And Microsoft's SLA explicitly excludes any sort of human error or human action that results in your data being deleted. So in all these cases, if you have data that goes away, you're going to be in trouble. Now, the question you're going to have is, how do I protect it? And the bottom line is that you've got a shared responsibility. The provider is going to take care of all the things that are here on the right, and on the left is all the things that you need to take care of. So let's talk about a few data loss use cases and the impact that they can have. The first one we call the folder delete grenade. And what the folder delete grenade does is essentially think of a file structure. Say this is in Google Drive. You've got a folder structure where you've got a top-level folder that's owned by Ryan. Ryan has got several docs in there, some that are owned by him, some that are owned by Pete. There are child folders in there, some owned by Ryan, another one owned by Pete. And in there, you've got files that are owned by different folks. Of course, they're shared across all of those. Ryan, Pete, Joe can see all of these files, and then there's a read-only link that's shared on that as well. Well, what happens if Ryan decides to delete his top folder, the use case 1 folder that's owned by Ryan? Well, when he deletes that, anything owned by Ryan is now going to be deleted. So it's not just that top-level folder, but now it's everything in there that was owned by him. The things that are owned by someone else are going to stay around. However, anything that's left is still shared with Ryan since he was the owner of the top-level folder. All read-only link sharing is removed, so Joe loses access to all of these other things that were not owned by him, even though he may need access to some of those things. And other people that had links to read this also can't see them. And all other access is only based on ownership. So now only Pete, with things that are shared with Ryan, can see the things that are owned by him. Obviously everything, as I said, because he owned the top level folder is owned by Ryan. Everything else is lost. So Pete can only see the things that are owned by him. Joe can only see the things that are owned by him. The impact of this, what this leaves you, is basically nothing shows in Google Drive since all items have no parent. So now when I go look in Google Drive, I'm not going to find them, and the only way I'm going to find them is going to be via a search capability. So that search capability is not very, well, it's reliable, but you need to know the exact name of the file or the contents of the file in order to go ahead and find it. And frankly, there's no good way to ascertain the damage and recreate what was lost. So you can see where you get this into this problem where you essentially have a whole lot of files that are sort of existing in the ether out there and you don't know where they are. Of course, the things that have been deleted from Google aren't recoverable, as we talked about before. The second thing to talk about is the case of malware or virus. And many will recall from a few years ago the CryptoLocker malware. That was a ransomware that infected your Microsoft Windows machines, would encrypt your files and hold them for ransom. So your options to recover them, what are they? Well, you could pay the ransom, or you could spend hours and days trying to determine the extent of the damage and revert the files one by one. The problem is, and we experienced this with one of our customers, was that they also used Google Drive. And of course, you have file sync and share solutions, sync all changes. So the files that were in Google Drive using the automatic sync capability and the little Google Drive widget that exists on your desktop or your laptop, once the Windows machine got infected and encrypted those files, the encryption was copied up to Google Drive and then to everybody else who also shared that and was syncing up with that file down onto their desktop. So in this case, Google Drive became actually a propagator of that sort of the effects of the CryptoLocker malware, not the actual malware itself, but the encrypted files ended up showing up on other people's desktops. Fortunately, they were expanding backup customer and they were able to recover from that environment. So you can easily see here, the thing to remember about file and sync and share solutions is that they sync all changes. So if I may make a mistake in one drive or one document, it is going to get replicated all over the place. The last one is what we call malicious email deletion. Again, we had another customer who experienced this, a large nonprofit organization. They had a mail, one of their fundraisers found out he was going to be terminated because he wasn't very effective, and he decided to delete all of his mail on his way out the door, including emptying his recycle bin. Even if the account had still existed, the mail is gone. So, all user deleted, when an account is deleted, is gone after 5 days. The new employee needed the deleted emails for pending deals. In this case, it was about managing large donors. So how do you go ahead and recover from that situation? And you might have legal hold software, may have the emails, but only if you have the prescience to put a legal hold on this to begin with. So the question becomes, how do you protect yourself from all of this? How can you minimize data loss and empower your users? And from our perspective, the right backup solution is the answer. You want to make sure you've got a backup solution that backs up all your relevant metadata. Backing up just the core data is not particularly interesting. It's important that it gets protected, but what's really important is the context of that data. So it also needs to be able to restore all the metadata along with your primary files. What that does, if you take that first case that we talked about, all those sharing settings is considered metadata. So when I restore Ryan's folder, what I want is I want all the other items that were in that folder to come back along with it, and I want all the sharing settings to get reinstated. As a result, you also need that to present an accurate view of your data structures in the restore view. So I want to be able to go see what the extent of my damage is. My backup system should show me, here's what your file system looked like on last Sunday, or on April 25th. Those are things that you should be able to know. You also want to make sure it performs point-in-time backups in order to save multiple versions of your files. This is really a key point. As I talked about, if you delete a file, the only thing that's there is the last version. We have examples of customers working on large spreadsheets. Somewhere along the way, an error gets entered into the spreadsheet, and the only way to fix it is potentially to go all the way back to a spreadsheet, a previous version you might have had from 14 days ago. The analyst creating the spreadsheet would go, I know that one was clean at that point. And of course, then it need to be able to restore from any point in time. That's always a key piece. And in the case of the last one that we talked about, the deleted email, you want to make sure that your email and data can be restored from one user to another. We see a use case for our customers, particularly where someone leaves the company and their job may be broken up across multiple other people. Well, you don't want to share that person's entire email with the people who are taking it over. You just want to share the specific emails about the projects they were working on that are pertinent with each of the individuals that are taking over the position. So those are all the things that we think you need to worry about with the right backup solution. Of course, now you got to put up with the spanning advertisement. We believe that we are the right backup solution, and the spanning difference from our perspective, quick and accurate restores, that's number one. We also want to empower end user and administrators to quickly restore data from any point in time. We want to make sure that it's easy to manage and monitor. It installs in minutes, keeps admins informed with a clear and actionable status reporting. And of course, it's secure and trusted. We are SSAE 16 certified, and we have over 5,000 customers around the world who are using our products to protect their SaaS applications today. We get down to the end, and I'll ask Jason to chime in here just as well. But we've kind of got some recommendations for you between Jason and myself, and that is that your data protection requirements and responsibilities do not change when you move to the cloud. As a SaaS administrator or an IT organization who's using SaaS applications, you need to think about your data protection just as you would when you're on-premise, with be it file, database, or virtual machines. You really need to work with your IT and business organizations to ensure that all of your data is covered. And you need to select a SaaS data protection vendor who you can trust. And Jason, would you like to add anything here to the recommendations? You with us, Jason?
I am.
Sorry. Go ahead.
It's that red flashy mute button. No one gets that including me. You know, the only thing I would add is actually a twist on the first one that we offered, and that was, you know, you need to back up cloud data the same way that you back up on-premise data from a mandate perspective. And again, I would just emphasize that what we habitually see is that as data protection gets decentralized, as the workload owners take on the responsibilities, because they do have a legitimate right to make sure that their production application that they're responsible for is well protected and well recovered, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be to the standard that the organization needs its data to be protected. It's corporate data, regardless of what platform it lives on. And so because of that, that's why it's so important for that second bullet that you really need to have a dialogue. The DBA needs to have a dialogue with the backup admin. The admin needs to have a dialogue with the backup admin. And yes, the SaaS admin needs to have a dialogue with the backup team to understand what are the responsibilities to make sure that the corporate data is protected to the corporate standards.
Great. Thank you. So real quickly onto a bit of Q&A. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. The first question that we got, and you know, I think maybe we answered this, but I do want to reiterate to make sure we're clear. One of the questions came in that says, isn't the public cloud provider typically responsible for data protection? And I think we covered that a bit, but I think it's worthwhile hitting it again. They are responsible for data protection, but they're primarily responsible for protecting your data from their errors. And that's where all the availability, all the backups they do come in. It's to ensure that your data within their system is available to you. Right. And then, go ahead, Jason, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so yeah, so if the provider has a catastrophic failure, certainly they don't have the luxury of coming back to you and saying, hey, you know, we kind of lost the mirror that had both copies of your data. Would you please reload your data into our system? They're not going to have that conversation. So they do have backups for the purposes of if they have a catastrophic failure in order to enable to resume service to you. But it's not a retention requirement. There's no long-term data at all. And one of the things I wanted to mention, you know, Jeff mentioned earlier in the session how folks, the provider can't tell between good deletes and bad deletes. And I want to point out there is good deletes. You know, as important as it is to retain data for the right business reasons, including regulatory compliance, e-discovery, prep, et cetera, it's also important to delete it with that same diligence. Right, so many organizations have a policy that says, you know, after 6 months, we want to delete, or after 24 months in a day, we want to delete. And so because of that, it would be improper for that SaaS provider to say, you know what, we're going to hold your data longer than you think. So in case you need it recovered, we can do that for you. Because in the world of e-discovery that we live in, when I want something deleted, I need it deleted. And so because of that, it absolutely is on the onus of the individual subscriber to say, this data I need to keep, this data I need to delete, and that is my responsibility.
Great, thank you. Couple other questions here, a few specifics about spanning, which be happy to answer very, very quickly. I think the first question was, you know, how many backup snapshots are available. We do daily backups, and every daily backup snapshot from the time you become a customer of ours is available. We never delete any of them unless there is some retention policy you have in place to have some of those purged. But our policy is that backups are there for a reason, and we never delete any of them. So your snapshots are available on a daily basis back to essentially the beginning of time. A question about how we perform backups. We use APIs, it's cloud-to-cloud backup, and we back it up to our own cloud infrastructure that we run at Amazon Web Services. Like many of the SaaS providers in the world today, we found them to be exceptionally reliable for our purposes. We've been on them for 5 years, and they've been an exceptionally good partner of ours. And then the last question we got was about whether or not spanning what we can back up in Office 365. And the question is, I understand spanning can only back up Office 365 mail. Can they now back up data, aka OneDrive or projects folders? And yes, the product that for ours on Office 365 that's about to go GA today is mail only. but we'll soon follow with other parts of Office 365, including OneDrive. So stay tuned for information on that. We are excited to get that out, and we'll definitely have that piece. So with that, I don't think there are any other questions that have come in, and we're just about to run out of time. Just a reminder about spanning backup. We've got spanning backup for Google Apps, spanning backup for Salesforce, and spanning backup for Office 365. And if you'd like some more details on us, some resources for you to go to, all on spanning.com. Of course, we offer a 14-day free trial, so we'd love to have you come in and work with us. Jason, I want to thank you very much for being here. For all of you attendees, you will be able to, you'll receive a link to the recorded version of this. Again, Jason, have a great day, and thank you for your time. Very much appreciate it. And all of you attendees, thank you as well.
Take care.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Bye-bye.